Picture yourself standing in the middle of Times Square. Towering neon signs compete for your attention. Taxi horns echo off the buildings. Thousands of strangers pass within inches of you without ever making eye contact. It's loud, chaotic, alive. Now imagine that in the blink of an eye, someone appears. Not walking from the sidewalk, not stepping out of a taxi, just there. He's confused, terrified, looking around as though he's just awakened from a dream. He's dressed in clothing that hasn't been fashionable for nearly 80 years. His boots are handmade. His beard is neatly trimmed in the style of the late 19th century. Every face around him is foreign. Every building is impossibly tall. Strange machines roar past him on streets that weren't even paved the last time he remembers seeing them. Before anyone can help, he steps backward. A speeding automobile slams into him. Instantly, he's dead. The police identify him as Rudolph Fentz, except Rudolph Fentz shouldn't exist. According to every official record they can uncover, this man vanished without a trace in 1876. No body, no explanation, no witnesses. He simply disappeared, only to supposedly reappear nearly 3/4 of a century later in the heart of New York City. At least, that's the story. Tonight we're following one of the internet's oldest and most enduring tales of time travel. A mystery that has inspired books, documentaries, conspiracy forums, YouTube channels, and countless late-night debates. Did a man really fall through time? Could modern physics offer an explanation? Or is this entire story hiding an even stranger secret? Because sometimes the truth behind the mystery is more unsettling than the mystery itself. I'm Malachi, and this is Stranger Things. If you've spent any amount of time wandering the darker corners of the internet, chances are you've stumbled across the story of Rudolph Fentz. It usually begins the same way. The year is 1950. Some versions say June. Others insist it happened on an unusually warm evening around 11:15 p.m. The location is always the same. Times Square. Even in 1950, Times Square was unlike almost anywhere else on Earth, the crossroads of the world. A place where tourists, businessmen, performers, sailors, soldiers, and dreamers all crossed paths beneath a forest of glowing signs. It was a city constantly reinventing itself, which makes what supposedly happened next feel almost believable. Witnesses allegedly noticed a man standing alone in the middle of the street. He wasn't begging, he wasn't intoxicated, he wasn't acting violently. He simply looked lost, terribly lost. Eyewitnesses supposedly described him turning slowly in circles. His breathing quickened. His eyes darted from one building to another. Imagine someone from the 1870s seeing Times Square for the first time. Electric billboards, automobiles, traffic lights, glass skyscrapers, streams of people dressed in styles completely unfamiliar. The sheer sensory overload would be enough to send anyone into panic. The man appeared frightened by everything around him. Then, according to the legend, he attempted to escape, not from danger, from confusion. He stepped backward into the street, and an automobile struck him almost instantly. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The man died at the scene. It seemed like another tragic traffic accident until police searched his pockets. That's when the story transforms from tragedy into legend. Among his belongings were items that made almost no sense. The first thing officers supposedly noticed was the man's clothing. Every piece appeared authentic to the late 19th century. Not theatrical, not a costume, not something rented for a play. The fabric was worn naturally. The stitching matched techniques used decades before World War I. Even the buttons appeared handmade, but it was his pockets that truly puzzled investigators. They allegedly found a handful of old-style business cards bearing the name Rudolph Fentz, a letter mailed from Philadelphia. The postmark was dated June 1876, a bill from a stable where a horse had supposedly been boarded, several dollars in obsolete currency, not collectible antiques, money that appeared to have been carried in someone's pocket continuously since the 19th century. Then came perhaps the strangest item, a brass token. According to the legend, it belonged to a beer hall or saloon that had disappeared generations earlier. The token supposedly showed almost no wear, as though it had never been spent. Then there was the watch. Every retelling mentions it. A heavy gold pocket watch, still running, still keeping time. Imagine being the detective opening that watch, listening to its steady ticking. A machine built nearly 80 years earlier, still marking each passing second, as though time itself had never stopped for its owner. The body was transported to the city morgue. Doctors conducted a routine examination. Nothing unusual, no signs of disease, no strange injuries beyond the collision. The man appeared healthy. Estimated age, around 30. Yet every clue surrounding him belonged to another century. Police reportedly contacted missing persons offices. No Rudolph Fentz had disappeared recently. No family came forward. No employer reported him missing. No hotel claimed him as a guest. It was as though he had materialized from nowhere. And then, one detective supposedly noticed something odd. The business cards listed an address that no longer existed. What had first seemed like an ordinary identification suddenly became the beginning of an impossible investigation. If the legend is true, this was the moment detectives stopped asking, "Who is this man?" and started asking, "When is he from?" That question would send investigators digging through dusty archives, forgotten city records, and decades-old missing person files. And according to the story, they were about to uncover something that would make this case one of the most famous time travel legends ever told. But here's where things begin to get truly interesting, because the deeper investigators supposedly dug, the more impossible Rudolph Fentz became. If you've listened to enough Stranger Things, you know there's a moment in every great mystery where the story pivots. For Rudolph Fentz, this is that moment. According to the legend, the New York Police Department assigned the bizarre case to a veteran detective named Captain Hubert V. Rim. The name appears in nearly every version of the story. He's portrayed as skeptical, methodical, the kind of investigator who believes every mystery has a logical answer, until this one. The clothing was impossible, the money was obsolete, the pocket watch belonged in a museum, but none of that proved time travel. At least, not yet. Rim allegedly began where any detective would. He traced the address printed on Rudolph Fentz's business cards, only to discover the building no longer existed. The neighborhood had been rebuilt decades earlier. Businesses had changed names, entire blocks had been redesigned. It was like trying to find a landmark on a map that had been erased by time itself. So he turned to city directories, old census records, tax documents, property deeds. Weeks supposedly passed as investigators dug through dusty archives beneath municipal buildings, and then they found him. Not the dead man, another Rudolph Fentz. This Rudolph Fentz had lived in New York in the late 1800s. Records described him as a respectable businessman, married, a father, living exactly where the mysterious business cards suggested. Then came the line that has fueled the legend for generations. One city record allegedly stated that Rudolph Fentz had disappeared in 1876. No warning, no explanation. One day he simply walked away and never returned. No body was ever found, no robbery, no evidence of murder, no witnesses, just gone. Imagine explaining that to a family in the 19th century. No security cameras, no DNA, no nationwide databases. A missing person could simply vanish into history. Except this case supposedly didn't end there. Detectives allegedly located descendants of the Fentz family. One elderly relative reportedly remembered hearing stories passed down through generations. A young man, 30 years old, walking out for an evening stroll, never coming home, no note, no enemies, no explanation, only heartbreak. The family eventually accepted that Rudolph had died somewhere unknown. The legend says they mourned him, buried an empty grave, and tried to move forward. Little did they know, according to the story, their missing relative would allegedly return 74 years later, already dead. If that sounds cinematic, you're not alone. This is precisely the point where believers become convinced, because unlike many ghost stories, this one seems filled with details, specific names, specific dates, specific evidence, the kind of details that make a story feel authentic, but details can be deceptive. We'll come back to that. For now, let's continue following the legend exactly as it's told, because it only gets stranger. By now, the Rudolph Fentz case had supposedly become something no police academy could prepare an officer for. If every record was accurate, then investigators faced only a handful of possibilities, none of them comfortable. Option 1, someone had orchestrated the most elaborate hoax imaginable, but why? No one claimed responsibility, no one made money from it. There were no newspaper interviews from a prankster years later saying, "I fooled everyone." Option 2, the man suffered from profound amnesia, except that didn't explain the antique currency, or the 19th century tailoring, or the supposedly authentic documents found in his pockets. Option 3, every piece of evidence had somehow been forged. Again, For what purpose? Then came the explanation that transformed Rudolph Fentz into a paranormal icon. Time travel. Not a machine. Not a secret government experiment. Not a portal hidden beneath Manhattan. Instead, a spontaneous rupture in reality itself. The theory suggests that Rudolph was simply walking through New York in 1876, perhaps thinking about dinner, perhaps heading home, perhaps crossing an ordinary street. Then, without warning, reality glitched. No dramatic lightning, no swirling vortex. Just one step, and suddenly he's standing in Times Square, except it isn't his Times Square anymore. The horse-drawn wagons are gone, gas lamps have vanished, buildings reach into the sky, electric signs flash brighter than daylight, strange roaring machines race past him. Everyone wears unfamiliar clothing. The language is the same, the city is not. If something like that happened to you, how long would it take before panic set in? 5 seconds? 10? Would you believe you'd gone insane? Would you think you were dreaming? Would you desperately search for something familiar? Or would you do exactly what Rudolph allegedly did, spin in confusion, step backward, and unknowingly into traffic? It's a haunting image, not because we know it happened, but because we can imagine how terrifying it would be if it had. Modern physics sometimes enters this conversation. You'll hear people mention wormholes, space-time curvature, quantum mechanics, even Einstein. Here's where it's important to separate fascinating science from unsupported claims. General relativity does show that time is flexible under extreme conditions. Massive gravity and incredible speeds can cause clocks to tick at different rates. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station actually age ever so slightly differently than we do on Earth. That's real science. But nothing in accepted physics suggests an ordinary pedestrian can accidentally leap 74 years into the future while walking down a New York street. Ideas like traversable wormholes and closed time-like curves remain highly theoretical. Interesting? Absolutely. Proven? Not even close. Yet stories like Rudolph Fentz persist because they take just enough genuine science and wrap it around a mystery that feels emotionally possible. Now comes the part of the story that many websites conveniently skip. Because once independent researchers began examining the Rudolph Fentz case, something curious happened. The evidence started disappearing. Researchers searched New York newspaper archives. Nothing. They checked death records. Nothing. Traffic accident reports. Nothing. Police files. Nothing. For such an extraordinary event, there was an extraordinary lack of contemporary documentation. Think about it. If a man dressed in authentic 19th century clothing had been struck and killed in Times Square, wouldn't every newspaper in America have covered it? The headlines practically write themselves. Man from 1876 found in Times Square. Mystery body baffles police. Time traveler or elaborate fraud. Yet, silence. No photographs. No morgue reports, no interviews, no archived editions of the New York Times, no official NYPD records that historians have been able to verify. Still, the story kept spreading. Books quoted earlier books. Magazine articles quoted older magazine articles. Later authors assumed earlier writers had already verified the facts. And that's one of the most dangerous things that can happen in research. A claim repeated often enough begins to wear the mask of evidence. Then, decades later, researchers finally traced the legend to its source. Not a police file, not a newspaper, not a government archive, a short story. In 1951, science fiction writer Jack Finney, best known for the novel The Body Snatchers, published a story titled I'm Scared. Inside that fictional tale was a nearly identical account of Rudolph Fentz. Names, dates, the mysterious disappearance, the impossible reappearance. Even many of the details matched almost perfectly. Somehow, over the following decades, that fictional story escaped its original context. It was later reproduced in collections without clear labeling as fiction. Writers of paranormal books encountered it, assumed it was based on a true incident, and cited it as historical fact. Then other authors cited them. By the time the internet arrived, the legend had become untethered from its fictional origin. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was history. Or at least, history according to thousands of websites copying one another. And isn't that almost as unsettling? Because if one fictional tale can quietly transform into accepted folklore over 70 years, how many other mysteries have traveled the very same road? The deeper we investigate Rudolph Fentz, the less it becomes a story about time travel, and the more it becomes a story about how legends are born. By the early days of the internet, the Rudolph Fentz story had taken on a life of its own. It had escaped books, escaped magazines, escaped the handful of people who knew where it actually came from. Now it lived in chain emails, message boards, early paranormal websites, forums dedicated to unexplained mysteries. Eventually, YouTube, TikTok, podcasts, social media, each retelling polished the edges a little more. Some versions insisted the incident occurred in June of 1950. Others claimed it was 1951. Some said dozens of eyewitnesses watched it happen. Others claimed hundreds. The detective's title changed. The evidence changed. The wording changed. But the core story never did. Because once people emotionally invest in a mystery, facts become surprisingly difficult to introduce. This phenomenon has a name. Researchers call it citation cascade. Imagine one author writes something inaccurate. A second author quotes it. A third author quotes the second. A fourth quotes the third. Pretty soon, nobody checks the original source anymore. Instead, everyone assumes someone else already did. The story becomes self-sustaining, like a snowball rolling downhill. Every revolution makes it larger, not because more evidence exists, but because more people are repeating it. The Rudolph Fentz case became one of the textbook examples of this phenomenon. Paranormal books throughout the 1970s and 1980s referenced it. Television specials treated it as an authentic mystery. Radio hosts repeated it. Magazine articles copied one another almost word for word. Eventually, the internet did what the internet does best. It accelerated everything. Today, if you search for Rudolph Fentz, you'll still find countless websites presenting the story as though it happened exactly as described. Some even claim the NYPD is covering it up. Others insist government agencies confiscated the evidence, and once a conspiracy enters the conversation, any missing evidence becomes proof. No records? They destroyed them. No newspaper articles? They suppressed them. No photographs? They confiscated them. It's an argument that's nearly impossible to disprove because every absence becomes another piece of the theory. Then came the people who weren't interested in proving the story, they wanted to verify it. Researchers, historians, and folklorists began tracing every citation backward. Not just one or two, every single one. One of the most thorough investigations was conducted by Chris Obeck, a researcher who specializes in historical anomalies and folklore. Instead of asking, "Could time travel happen?" he asked, "Where did this story first appear?" That's a completely different question, and it changed everything. Obeck followed the paper trail through decades of paranormal literature. Every reference led to an earlier reference. Every earlier reference led to another, like peeling layers from an onion, until eventually there were no more layers. At the center was Jack Finney, a science fiction author, not a police detective, not a newspaper reporter, a storyteller. His 1951 short story, I'm Scared, contained what appears to be the original Rudolph Fentz tale. Years later, the story was reproduced in another publication without clearly identifying it as fiction. Readers assumed it was a true historical account. Other writers repeated that assumption, and from there, the legend spread around the world. One misunderstanding, repeated thousands, perhaps millions of times. Ironically, the investigation into Rudolph Fentz turned out to be every bit as fascinating as the alleged time traveler himself, because it exposed something even stranger, not a wrinkle in space-time, but a wrinkle in human nature. So, does that mean we should close the book on Rudolph Fentz forever? Not quite. Because while the specific story almost certainly originated as fiction, the questions it raises remain very real. Let's talk about time, real time, not the Hollywood version. Einstein fundamentally changed the way humanity thinks about it. Before the early 20th century, time was often imagined as a giant universal clock, ticking at the same pace for everyone, everywhere. Einstein shattered that idea. Time bends, time stretches, time slows. Under extreme gravity, time moves differently. Near incredible speeds, time flows differently. We've measured this. GPS satellites actually have to account for relativistic effects. If they didn't, your navigation would drift by miles over time. That's not science fiction, that's engineering. So, could someone travel into the future? In a way, yes. If you traveled close to the speed of light and returned to Earth, less time would have passed for you than for everyone else. You would effectively leap into Earth's future. This has been demonstrated mathematically and experimentally through relativity, but traveling backward, that's where things become far murkier. Physicists have proposed ideas involving wormholes, rotating black holes, and closed time-like curves. Some equations appear to permit bizarre possibilities. Others collapse under impossible energy requirements. Many require forms of matter we've never observed. It's fascinating territory, but today it remains theoretical. There is no verified evidence that any human being has accidentally, intentionally, or otherwise traveled decades backward or forward in the dramatic way the Rudolph Fentz legend describes. Yet, maybe that's why we keep telling stories like this, because they speak to something deeply human. Who hasn't wondered, what if I could see the future? What if I could fix the past? What if one wrong turn, one unexpected step, could send me somewhere impossible? These aren't just questions about physics, they're questions about regret, hope, destiny, and our endless fascination with the unknown. Perhaps Rudolph Fentz survives because he represents every one of us, someone dropped into a world that no longer makes sense, trying desperately to understand it, looking for something familiar, searching for home. In the end, the Rudolph Fentz mystery isn't really about whether one man traveled through time. It's about how stories travel through time. A fictional tale written in the early 1950s somehow escaped its pages. It crossed oceans, generations, languages, technologies, and today, more than 70 years later, people still argue about whether it really happened. That's a remarkable journey, even if Rudolph himself never took it. There's an old saying among historians, the past is another country. Maybe that's true, but legends don't stay in the past. They evolve, they adapt. They quietly rewrite themselves every time someone tells them around a campfire, shares them in a book, or uploads them to the internet. The Rudolph Fentz story reminds us that mystery doesn't always come wrapped in truth. Sometimes, the mystery is how easily fiction can become folklore, how confidently a rumor can dress itself in the clothing of history, and how desperately we want to believe that somewhere, somehow, the impossible might still be possible. Maybe that's why stories like this never really die, not because they're true, but because they invite us to imagine a universe that's just a little stranger than the one we know. And if there's one thing we've learned here on Stranger Things, it's that reality has a habit of being weird enough all by itself. So the next time you find yourself walking through a crowded city, take a moment to look around. Everyone you pass has a story. Most are ordinary, some are extraordinary, and somewhere, perhaps, another legend is being born. I'm Malachi. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, be sure to follow, subscribe, and share Stranger Things with the curious minds in your life. Leave a review. Tell us what mystery you want us to uncover next. And remember, keep asking questions, keep chasing the unknown, and above all, keep your eyes open. Because sometimes, the strangest things are the stories we choose to believe.